Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and I'm with Audrey Waters, and this is the weekly Hack Education podcast. Hi, Audrey.
Hello, happy Labor Day.
We are laboring on Labor Day. It is the 3rd of September 2012, and this is the regular time that we've set aside for talking about Audrey's blog posts at Hack Education and her summary of news stories for the week. And we're going to start out talking about what looked promising, but maybe turned out not to be, Coursera's peer assessment program.
Yeah, I was really excited when Coursera launched, and this is one of the two startups that we saw come out of Stanford's MOOCs from last fall. This is the one that's being that was founded by Daphne Koller and Andrew Ng. This Coursera, one of the things that I found really interesting about Coursera was that they stated right away that they wanted to use peer grading, peer assessment, in lieu of relying solely on the sort of automated grading software that some of these, or certainly the other classes that they offered at Stanford, the other MOOCs that they offered at Stanford, as well as Udacity, their sort of competitor startup in this space, was using. So the idea of peer assessment, I thought, was really intriguing. Moves a lot closer to social learning, to having peers be actively engaged with not just the material, but with learning in a community with one another. But unfortunately, sort of when the rubber hits the road, and it has with a couple of courses that are now underway, it looks as though there's still a lot of kinks to be worked out with Coursera's peer grading system.
So if I understood your article correctly, it sounded a lot less like the kind of peer grading that would take place in a small classroom, or the peer reading and assessment, and a lot more like the kind of garbage you get at the end of a newspaper article.
That's actually, I think that's sort of the case right now. I should explain a little bit more. The way in which the peer assessment works with Coursera is it's a little bit, the way in which they described it to me too as well, is it's a little bit like the process of Mechanical Turk. So that is, you sort of Mechanical Turk, you sort of crowdsource these micro tasks. And in the case of Coursera's peer assessment, when students do write an essay, they're distributed to several of their peers in the class who grade them on a scale of 0 to 3, with 3 being sort of the perfect score. And then your composite grade is based on the average of what your peers grade you. And so there are a number of problems with this, least of which being in the sort of in these massive classes, there really isn't a community of peers that you are familiar with, that you understand them personally, that you're able to respond not just based on, not just respond to the essay, but you can sort of understand who wrote it, the context, some of their strengths and weaknesses, based on how you observe them and understand them in the classroom. You have a relationship with your peers. Unfortunately, in Coursera, that's not really the case. These are all anonymous, and a lot of the feedback, or quite a bit of the feedback, has been ridiculously unhelpful, and not just sort of slapping a 2, which is sort of the number for good on a thing, but really sort of writing feedback that's mocking people's English skills, mocking people's understanding and their writing, and in a lot of cases flagging things as plagiarism when they might not actually be plagiarism. So a lot of problems, and a lack of community, I think, that it stems from.
Yeah, it seems like it's a kind of a combination of scope and community. But the anonymity piece feels critical, because where this kind of a system of feedback works, whether it's restaurants or books or other things, you can still have this the large scope, and you can still not have the community, but you have a kind of feedback mechanism and even a check and a balance.
Yes.
Right? So you can see how many times someone's participation was considered to be helpful. So I may not know
Right.
that person. It can be completely outside of my community, but at least I have some way to gauge it. If this is experimentation, then I actually kind of want to clap for them, which is, hey, way to go, trying something out. This seems like it's not working. If the end goal is to actually find something better.
Yeah, I mean, and there was a really interesting article in Inside Higher Ed after I wrote this one that looked more closely at Chuck Severance's class. He's currently teaching an internet history class and had started using the peer assessment as part of the grades for the class, and sort of ran into some of these problems and changed his mind about requiring the sort of feedback. But what's unfortunately the option has been to rely then on multiple choice quizzes, and so it is the sort of difficult position that both the instructors and the students find themselves in, that you either sort of use this automated system which is based on multiple choice testing, or you sort of trudge, sort of move forward with the peer assessment that really doesn't seem to be working particularly well. And I think, and although, as you say, this is, certainly is an experiment, there's nothing to say that you can't still have the peer assessment in your class, just not make it count. But it does look as though there are lots of things that sort of need to be tweaked to make people feel as though there's really a level of reciprocity in the way in which they're giving feedback to each other, and this isn't just about sort of in some ways sort of punishing your peers who might not write the way in which you deem a college level student should write.
So having been on the receiving end of what I would say is a blog post from 5 years ago, the kind of diatribe ad hominem attack this week against me for not being more proactive in getting minorities to EduBloggerCon, which is now called Social EdCon, which is an event I just hold in conjunction with the ISTE conference, where I'm not even in charge of the attendees or membership, and I make it open to anyone who wants to attend. But I was remembering kind of how the internet was 5 years ago, and the kind of the nastiness, and I saw that in the comments from this Coursera peer assessment, and I thought, okay, so we really we have learned a lot in those 5 years to move forward from this place.
Yeah, and I think that this is, I think that this is one of the challenges that we see in numerous social networks, and numerous social networks that are now being used for educational purposes. I think that there are some interesting cases I think that there are plenty of reasons why someone would want to protect their identity, would want, when people don't feel comfortable attaching their real name to their online comments. But that being said, I do think that in the case of building a community, which we should be doing when we're participating in a class together, I do think that respect and reciprocity are really important, and it's hard to cultivate that when you have some people who are really just being trolls and not really being respectful members of the community.
Well, if this is part of the experiment process, I'm really anxious to see what comes next, because it doesn't sound like it can live in this particular incarnation. And I get the sense from you that you were disappointed in the peer assessment, but I also get the sense this isn't the end of the story.
Right. I think that I continue to sign up for these Coursera classes too. I think that it's going to be really important, particularly if Coursera and Udacity and MITx and edX move forward. And out of the disciplines that can be more easily assessed through multiple choice, then we really are going to have to come up with better ways to review each other's work, to have a sort of massively open online peer review of learners' work. And so I think, I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see people work the kinks out. I think the poetry class starts with Coursera next week, and there will be I can't imagine multiple choice being used in that setting, but we'll see.
Well, I don't want to skip around too much here, but it does feel like we could talk about the where are my notes here? The David Wiley course, EdTech Startup 101. Well, that's actually the next story.
Yeah.
Because intriguingly, by pushing the content creation to the user's own sites, you have a very natural kind of assessment that takes place, which is people either look or they don't. They're either follow or they don't. The kind of assessment that those of us who've been participating in social media for years now experience as just part of our being in an authentic relationship with the rest of the world. And if we're saying something people are interested in, they watch and they pay attention. And if we say something that they aren't, either we've made a mistake or we say, hey, I just have a different vision. So is that a fair way of sort of drawing a distinction between the two? That in fact maybe part of what needs to happen here is to kind of push that material outside of the course?
I think that that's a really interesting way to think about it, and I think I'm really interested to see how this class unfolds, how David Wiley's Ed Startup 101 class unfolds. Partially because I do think that it's purposefully operating at a really interesting intersection that is a College of Education, where Wiley is a professor, and Department of Ed, of course, where his co-teacher Richard Coletta works, but then also the startup culture, startup community, which I think has a fair amount of suspicion, if not hostility, towards both of those institutions. And so I think in some ways it's sort of moving everyone outside their bubble, outside their comfort zone, I should say, outside the comfort zone of the university, outside the comfort zone of the College of Education type setting, and then also hopefully for startups and entrepreneurs who are participating, also moving, recognizing the importance of being grounded in some of these academic research theories that people are, I think, too quick to dismiss in Silicon Valley in particular.
In some of the most enjoyable to read sentences that you've written in a long time for me, you talk about the gulf between educators and entrepreneurs. And then you talk about the currents that flow in different directions. I thought this was pretty brilliant. And how a lot of those currents flow away from education theory, away from education history, and away from education research. And in your video, I also sort of hear this question of, is the startup process or ecosystem really the way to bring about change?
Yeah, I'm not fully convinced that it is. Now, I think that we should be, I think that institutions, particularly academic institutions, need to be a lot more entrepreneurial, or intrapreneurial, I suppose is maybe the term that people use. I do think that we need to be more agile, more experimental, more willing to try things and link research to practice, and not just practice within a lab setting, but practice in the real world. But I'm not sure if that is necessarily a startup. By that I mean sort of a for-profit business. I think that there are ways that we can make change in education that aren't necessarily reliant on market forces, on investors, or even on the sorts of risk-taking that entrepreneurs like to take. Again, I think that there's some unsettling things in and around that. I should note, though, that David Wiley responded to my video with his own video and gave a good reminder, which is that, the colleges of education are often so anti-business and so uncomfortable talking about money that often these questions don't get addressed at all, and that people are sort of actively discouraged, and people who are specialists in sort of theory and research and pedagogy are discouraged from thinking about their ideas in an entrepreneurial way. And so, I do think it's important to have these conversations and to bridge this gulf, because I think it's a gulf that doesn't really get us anywhere. It gets us with some bad products and interesting research that doesn't go anywhere outside of a grant cycle.
So one of the things that I wondered about, I've been looking forward to hearing about this story for a long time. How collaborative has the process been from the conception to fulfillment side of the actual course? Does it have that feeling that the Siemens Downs kind of constructivist MOOCs did of being highly inclusive, or is it kind of a pet project? That was one of my concerns.
That's a really good question, and I think it's a little early to tell. This was just the first, or this now is the second week of the class, and it does feel as though, in some ways, that the scope of the class has been laid out. The syllabus is set. What we'll be discussing each week is set. That's not to say that the participants won't take conversations down different paths, and of course, because people are encouraged to work on their own, blog on their own sites, make their own videos, rather than just have the stuff stuck in a closed learning management system. I do think that there are opportunities to make connections and go down different avenues than perhaps the instructors are planning. But it does feel as though this is that the agenda is sort of set in stone here. We'll see. Both Stephen Downs and I are participating, so it's going to be fun for that.
That will be fun. Well, but one of the things that sort of distinguishes those constructivist MOOCs was lots of guest lectures, lots of other people involved, which I'm not being critical of David Wiley or those creating this course, but it's harder to imagine if it's being done under the auspices of the university, which has sort of a vested interest in having it reflect well on the university.
Yeah, but there are going to be several guest lectures this week. Betsy Corcoran from EdSurge, in fact, I think is the guest speaker, and so we'll see. I think that this class also grows out of another class that's offered at BYU on social entrepreneurship. So the university, in that case, does have, I think, some established, I think is already committed to thinking through how do we help students build socially responsible businesses. So it does seem to connect to rather than necessarily disrupt sort of a larger effort at BYU.
And that may be good.
Yeah.
So, good. Well, we'll look forward to more news there. So your survey on OER usage, are you getting responses?
I've got quite a few responses. It's definitely interesting to see the kinds of things that people are interested in using, and the places where a few people recognize both gulfs or gaps in the content and sort of shrug their shoulders and say it just all seems like too much work. It seems like too much work to find, too much work to assemble, too much work to use something other than a prepackaged set of materials, which is interesting. So I'll have some more stories this week about the results from this research. Yeah.
Oh, good. So we've talked about MacGuffins, we've talked about red herrings, but I don't think either really described this next story. I wanted to posit that maybe this is the magician's misdirection. So sort of look at my one hand while I do something with the other. This is the bundling of textbooks costs with tuition. This was flabbergasting to me.
Yeah, this story was actually buried, or this particular story was sort of inspired by a line that was sort of buried in a press release, a back-to-school press release from Follett, which run, I think they're one of the largest distributors and chains of, or suppliers of college bookstores, textbooks for college bookstores. And they're promoting a new service that will do just this, which will allow students to get their digital copies of their textbook materials as bundled as part of their student fees. So on one hand, that sounds like great for the sake of convenience, and Follett promise, and other providers who promise this, they say, you know, there's great cost savings here. But I think that's really very, very debatable. And as we've continued to see students really not be interested in digital textbooks for a number of reasons, cost really just being one of them, this does feel like a bit of a shell game to remove what looks like a painful, you know, the sticker shock of buying your books at a bookstore, to sort of move that sticker shock elsewhere, and perhaps stick it on a bill that isn't itemized, and bury the costs elsewhere. So I think that this is a really a negative for students and for college affordability as well.
Well, somewhere somebody took the afternoon off after they had the idea, because there is a little bit of brilliance to it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have the issue of being able to then have this be a part of your tuition funding discussion. So whether it's financial aid or your parents or the like, you know, it sort of establishes a fixed cost. Anybody with children in college knows that that second week phone call from your child telling you the total of the textbooks is not a call you look forward to. I mean, so there is some brilliance to it. At the same time,
and I'd add too the brilliance too of tapping into this new craze for data, right? So it's definitely something that providers here can say, well, you'll get, because you're having digital copies through our system. You'll be able to know exactly what students are reading. You'll be able to make sure that everyone owns the book. You'll be able to see who's doing the material. You'll be able to track all of these things that you can't track with printed copies. So I think it feeds into that narrative as well.
And it's a little Apple-esque, right?
Mm-hmm.
You may not actually own the textbook afterwards.
Right.
So it may be a rental, or you own it during the period of time that you're a student, and they are digital. Are they all digital?
They are digital. So far, there are a couple of companies that are working on this idea. Follett being one of them, CourseLoad being another, and these are digital. They're not just textbooks. They are digital materials, so they don't necessarily have to be a textbook per se. It's materials very broadly speaking, but yeah, the emphasis is digital.
Interesting. Well, so yes, full disclosure, Follett has been a sponsor of a couple of my events and activities, and I've really appreciated that. So I know that I put myself out a little bit on a limb criticizing a policy, but that kind of goes back to this whole question of gulfs and divides and also entanglements. Yeah. Right. I mean, the moment that you feel awkward about saying what you think is right because of the financial entanglements, it is in part kind of the story of one of the dangers of I can't remember the verb here, but of taking education and putting it into a business context. Right? Those entanglements have definite realities to them.
I think they do, and I think that as things get, I think that things are really complicated, and I think that it's often easier said than done to have sort of disclosure policies to say, to sort of, it gets more and more difficult the more and more complex things get, I think, sort of be transparent, to sort of show where the funding is coming from in some of these cases, where how the decisions are getting made. I think and I think it requires that as as educators and as consumers, as students, as parents, as citizens, we have to be ever more vigilant about these sorts of things.
And I think it's worth recognizing that they do have an influence, right? I mean, that I would feel hesitant to say something about a Follett program because Follett provides me with some financial support is a microcosm of a much larger issue where so much of what takes place is driven by the funding.
Yeah, no, I think that's true.
So I don't want to draw an inappropriate segue, but it felt like that kind of brings us to your dropping out of the PhD program. I felt like reading your story that you faced this moment of choice, and that it's a really important choice, and it's one that we don't necessarily support as much as we ought to.
Yeah, it's interesting to me to sort of revisit this story in a number of ways. So August 29th was the 7th anniversary of my then husband's passing. He died of liver cancer about 10 months after being diagnosed with it. He was 34. And I was in the middle of a PhD program, and it, for a number of reasons, both my thoughts on the education industry and the medical industry, the insurance industry, and I think it's difficult to separate some of the strands of these stories and think about the ways in which we are supposed to move through the world making good decisions for our future self, planning ahead. And I think grad school is very much about that, where you sort of put your life, your income earning ability on hold, but for the promise at the end that you're going to, with a PhD. Not everyone goes down the professor path, of course, but for many of us, that's sort of the end goal, a professor, a tenure track position as a professor. And I think sort of my experiences in having all of that turned on its head in as traumatic ways I can even imagine, has led me to a lot of soul searching, and soul searching continually. I always sort of check myself about what I'm doing and why, and thinking about sort of the meaning of the work I do and having impact. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, it does, and again, it's a very personal story, and it's hard to read it without really feeling just not only the story of your husband's death, but that you choose not to allow yourself the convenient narrative. Right? I mean, the convenient narrative would be to sort of analyze the job market, the hours, the time, what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
But I read in the story that there's this emotional piece of, if education isn't about understanding and supporting other people, if it becomes so much about the bureaucracy and the politics that people can't even understand what I'm going through when my husband is dying, do I really want to be here?
I think that was certainly the realization that I came to, and it's been a long time. It's been a long time now since he died, and several years as well since I dropped out of a PhD program. But I do, I remember several times having interactions with various faculty members that I thought they were my mentors, that seemed so oblivious to what my emotional needs were, and it really struck me as just another example of the way in which these massive institutions really fail. They fail to account for the personal and for the human and for the messiness. I mean, my story is incredibly messy. I mean, being widowed at 34 with a young son, he was 12 at the time. That's a messy story, but all of our lives are messy, and there are so many ways in which I think students, undergraduates, graduate students, all of us struggle, and these institutions are sort of these bureaucratic, faceless institutions sort of just move forward ceaselessly and without recognizing sort of our individuality, our pain. They really don't meet our needs at a personal or human level. And to me, it's a tragedy no matter the institution, but it's even more tragic when it's education, which is supposed to be, for me at least, this moment of sort of personal exploration and fulfillment, and not about sort of a soul-sucking machine.
So I've done a couple of interviews that I feel like really touch on this. Roger Schenck talked in an interview I did with him a lot about, what really drives a university, and used his own stories of getting hired and the kind of the grant funding and the foundation funding that would come because of his being there and setting up kind of a center, and the degree to which it really had very little to do with the kind of personal connections that we imagine would help someone as an undergraduate really succeed. And then Tony Wagner this week talked about how in his research on innovation and creativity that it was often, and maybe most often, the non-tenured, scrambling every year to make ends meet faculty member who was actually making the most difference for the undergraduates. And he cited a particular program at Stanford where, there's this very significant following of people who recognize that this one man had really made a huge difference for all of them, but in fact is not tenured and probably won't be tenured.
Yeah, and I think that, I do think that particularly around tenure and more broadly sort of labor relations right now at the university level is really interesting and really fraught. And I think you see universities increasingly turning to adjuncts. But I think that the hard part of that is that even if you are, you have to sacrifice so much of yourself financially. It's just a difficult position. It's a difficult position to be in, and I do think a lot of people, myself included, went into education because they wanted to make a difference. I loved working with students. I loved the idea that I was helping them unfold, think, learn how to express themselves, find their place in the world. But I think that for me at least, I've recognized that I can do that outside the institution of higher ed, and I think I do it better from here.
Interesting. Okay, so you're doing your monthly new and noteworthy educational apps, and you have some positive words for Khan Academy. If they're listening, I'm sure they're applauding.
Well, I do think that the new computer science curriculum that Khan Academy offers is a huge leap forward in the way in which the organization is thinking about teaching and learning. I think that you can see it's definitely taking steps towards hands-on experimentation, play, in a way that you don't see in the sort of videos or the multiple choice exercises that it's become so well known for. I think that there are a lot of folks who are offering similar types of web interfaces to help people learn to program. I think it's interesting that they're starting with JavaScript. But I really do applaud Khan Academy for thinking carefully about how to teach novices programming. And certainly they could have done the easy step, which would be sort of record a bunch more lectures, and they've done something really different. So I think it's a great first step that I definitely applaud them for, and I'd love to see the sort of interactive tool be applied to some of the other areas that they teach as well. I mean, why not have something like this for math? Why not have something like this for physics?
Okay, so I'm sure that Khan Academy is applauding somewhere. So moving on to the news, I watched some of the Republican National Convention, and I'm kind of wondering out loud here, is there anybody in national politics who's actually saying anything smart about education?
Let me think. No one's coming to mind.
No, really. I mean, this is
No.
so interesting that the pretty consistent narrative across political parties is accountability. And
yeah. No, I think.
Go ahead.
No, I think that. I mean, I think that it's really interesting. I mean, today being Labor Day, you know, I think it's fine to say that the Democratic Party was long a party associated with unions, and teachers have historically had, you know, been a strong union contingent. But it certainly doesn't feel as though the Democratic Party is speaking intelligently about education. They're certainly making it clear, particularly in places like Chicago, that they aren't friends with the unions. And the Republican Party made it very clear in some of its speeches as well that it was, you know, it saw unions as being the roadblock to school reform, touting accountability, as you said. I think that I can't think of any politician right now that I would point to and say that person is has it right.
I'm just so fascinated that we seem to be moving in the opposite direction of, even if you believe that the international PISA tests are measuring something of value, that we're just not moving in the same direction as anybody who seems to be making headway, and that I don't feel like we have a good spokesperson for education that I'm hearing in politics at all. I'm intrigued by that.
Yeah. I should note here that the winning video for the Mystery Teacher Theater 2000 contest is really worth watching. It's fairly long. I think it's 11, maybe even 18 minutes long, by Michael Persson. But it's What If Khan Academy was made in Japan, and it gets really to the heart of precisely what you're talking about, with the different ways in which math education, in particular, occurs in other countries. And I think it's a really great reminder of the direction that we're heading in this country is actually likely to sort of make things, or not even likely, it will make things worse. It's not taking a step in the direction of making our students stronger, more creative, more critical. And so I definitely recommend that video if folks haven't watched it yet.
And that is in your news summary. It's embedded,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm unfortunately under a deadline, so we can't talk about RFID identification chips that students are being required to wear. We can't talk about a dream team of teachers producing, of course, the best videos of the best teachers. We're not going to be able to talk about EdSurge getting $400,000, although I know you and I both probably really want to talk about that.
Yes.
Or the fact that kids are skipping school. All kinds of kids are skipping school, and they think that nobody's noticing, and maybe probably they aren't noticing.
Or that Newt Gingrich held a MOOC, which I think is officially means MOOCs are done. We're done with MOOCs.
Jumped the shark. When Newt Gingrich has a MOOC, you've jumped the shark, right? I mean, I think so. Funniest moment. I think. I wonder if it was valuable at all.
I'm sure it was. I wonder if you could you get a little certificate.
A badge.
A badge.
You get a Newt badge. A little pollywog. Okay, so there's
a good place to end it.
It is a good place to end it. There's a lot of good information in Audrey's weekly summary that I'm sorry we haven't had time to talk about. But Audrey, thanks again for a fascinating week and for the work you're doing.
Thanks, Steve. Brett, we'll talk to you next week then.
Okay. Bye now.